Alberto.
Welcome everybody with the new DN25 Goes Local episode. Today, my name is Bond, Green Bond, with Antonella Torcino and Adam from Greenpeace. Welcome everybody.
Hello.
Good evening.
Good afternoon. Well, this is the second episode, as Alberto said. In the first one, we talk about green public work, green job, and other social protection like universal basic income. And this afternoon, we move toward the financial aspect of the Green New Deal for Europe. We will analyze the incentives and disincentives that can be transmitted to the economy through monetary policy and financial instruments. I'm very happy to introduce our guest, Adam Pawloff. I want to introduce him. He has a master's degree in political science from the University of Vienna, where he lives. And he is an expert for national and international climate policy. For almost a decade, he co-organized Earth Talks, which is the largest civil society-driven environmental event in Austria. And from 2010 and 2015, he taught and collaborate with the Center for Global Change and Sustainability at the University of Natural Resources and Applied Life Sciences. And since 2015, he works for Greenpeace as a senior climate and energy campaigner. And with this role, he participated to the conference, to the climate conference in Paris, Katowice, and Marrakesh. He works actually for financial institutions in the context of the phase out of fossil fuel in Europe. So nice to be here, Adam. And as author of the Greenpeace analysis published at the beginning of June, titled Bankrolling the Climate Crisis, about carbon footprint of ECB monetary policy, aiming at increasing the money supply, which is necessary in a crisis, either financial, either pandemic. And so please tell us the key results of this analysis of this paper, please.
Sure, I'm more than happy to do so. I'd like to say thank you very much for the invitation to join you this evening. Good to be with you. Yeah, so maybe before I come to the results of our paper specifically, there has been quite a lot of studies and research in the last 2 or 3 years that have looked at the bond purchasing programs of the European Central Bank, of the Bank of England, of the Federal Reserve in the US. And what most of these studies have found is that when these institutions purchase bonds from companies, from corporates, they tend to significantly overweight fossil fuel assets and other high carbon assets. There's a few reasons for that. And I think it's maybe interesting just to point to some of the reasons why that is, where you can also then maybe think about ways in which that could be changed in future. So what the ECB does when it goes into the corporate bond market, it has a number of criteria that it applies. So the first thing it says is it won't buy any bonds from banks or other financial institutions. So that already takes away some of the market. Then it says it will only buy bonds that have an investment grade rating. So that takes away another bit of the market. And there's a number of other criteria, which include the size of the company, that the ECB applies. And then when you compare sort of the universe of bonds that the ECB buys from to the universe of bonds as it is as a whole, you find that particularly oil and gas, but also utilities and high carbon sectors like manufacturing or cement are significantly overweight. I mean, just to give you one example, if you look at the normal European bond market, then utilities make up around 5%. When you look at what the ECB buys, they make up 20 to 25%. So there is just a bit of a comparison. Yeah. And so what we looked at in the analysis that you mentioned was a specific window in time from the beginning of the European Central Bank's response to the coronavirus pandemic until about mid-May. So a period of about 2 months, we had a look at the corporate bonds that they've been buying. And I might add, before I go to the results, that it's not, so the European Central Bank is not entirely transparent. So there are certain pieces of information that the bank publishes on its homepage. There are other pieces of information that it does not publish. And so we needed to make certain assumptions.
In automatico messo come speaker view. Quindi quando apri il microfono.
So, yeah, so we had to make certain assumptions to to figure out how much they'd been buying of each individual companies, but it turns out these assumptions were fairly accurate. And what we found is that in these 2 months, the ECB spent about 30 billion euros on buying corporate bonds. The total value of the bonds that they bought were about 120 billion. So it's buying a quarter of all of these bonds. And what we also found is basically confirms what prior research has shown. So there's a lot of very, very carbon heavy companies. There's oil and gas, a company you in Italy know well, Eni, but also there's Shell, Total. So all of the big oil and gas companies in Europe, a number of the coal companies, there's airports, highways, car manufacturing companies, and so on. I mean, a couple of sort of specific results that we have here. So, for example, they spent 2.5 billion on the bonds of integrated oil and gas companies. And when you look at how much CO2 that is attributed to those purchases, it's sort of a size of about 8 million tons of CO2. That's 10% of the annual emissions of the country I currently live in. So this is has a really, really big climate impact, a really, really big carbon footprint. And there's many things that the ECB can do, and we will, I think, talk about that a little bit later. But I think this is one of the areas where one sees quite clearly that when the ECB spends money, and it spends a lot of money, then this has a really negative effect on the climate.
Thank you very much. So in the title, we called black bond against the green bond. So they are overweighted into the ECB portfolio. And before we move to the second question, let me introduce certain basic concepts that can be unfamiliar about monetary policy tools. Well, first of all, we have to clarify the ECB mandate, which is focused on the price stability. And ECB has a unique mandate on inflation against the fact that Federal Reserve, for instance, has a double mandate, either price stability, either the unemployment rate below a certain level. That means that ceteris paribus, if we had the same inflation, the Federal Reserve can be more accommodative if there is a high level of unemployment. And this is a big issue. And another principle to bear in mind is the fact that for ECB is compelled the monetary financing of government bond, which is written into the 123 article of the Treaty of Functioning. So the way in which the ECB inflow the liquidity into the system is not buying on issue the bond, either government or corporate bond, but only in the secondary market. And the agents of the secondary market are financial institutions, banks. So if the banks has, for instance, capital constraint, the transmission of monetary policy, of the positive impulse of monetary policy can be more difficult. Another way is a direct inflow of liquidity through so-called helicopter money, in the sense that central banks can credit the bank account of citizen, but this is not a tool that ECB has never used. And even the outright monetary transaction, which is the acquiring of corporate bond or government bond, has been criticized by Deutsche Bank, for instance, you know, because in their opinion, it's a way to curb, to turn the political, the monetary policy toward the fiscal policy in a commodity, in an expansionary way. But anyway, during this crisis, I noticed that there is less criticism toward an expansionary an expansionary monetary policy. Anyway, during this pandemic, the Green New Deal for Europe campaign found that the European Central Bank must prioritize toward other goals instead of price stability, which is a target which is not binding, especially in a phase of deflation. So European Central Bank should be more oriented toward employment, social progress, and especially environmental protection. And as you told before, is not very good that their policy from this side. Anyway, can you summarize the main evolving stage of the quantitative easing and the evolution of purchasing program since 2014 and 2020 of the ECB?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I mean, maybe a couple of comments on what you just said, because I think it's really important, this this background and sort of, you know, what the bank is actually aiming to do. And you mentioned, for example, that there's been a lot less criticism of the bond buying this time round. And I mean, personally, I'm not an economist, but it is very interesting that the economic theory actually, you know, always said that when a central bank essentially starts printing money, when a central bank pours a lot of money into the economy, that will drive inflation up. And what we have seen over the last few years through the quantitative easing programs of the ECB is that just has not been the case. So yeah, we see that, you know, sort of one of the traditional sort of areas of thought, and one of the traditional, you know, theories, monetary theories, doesn't seem to quite hold anymore. And I think that's one of sort of the reasons why there has maybe been less criticism. And before I come to your question, I do also, I think your last point is a very interesting one. The fact that the ECB should also be prioritizing social welfare and environmental protection. I mean, I think when you look at sort of the mainstream, the debate, the jury is very much out on the question, you know, how far does the mandate of a central bank reach? I mean, the main mandate is price stability. The secondary mandate that the ECB has is financial stability. And I think, especially when it comes to the climate emergency, one could very much make the argument that, you know, when we are in the middle of the climate emergency that is literally beginning in the last few years, but it's going to get a lot more serious in the next 5, 10, 20, and 30 years, you know, that will pose a significant threat to financial stability. So I think an argument really can be made that actually the ECB has a mandate. And in fact, another interesting point is that the ECB is, at the end of the day, as you mentioned, governed by the Treaty of the European Union. And that, in effect, does also convey a certain social and environmental mandate. And there are also groups that are going to take this issue to a court of law and see what the European Court has to say about exactly that question. But to come to your question specifically, so quantitative easing is something that in other countries, in other regions of the world, has been going on for quite a long time. It began, I think, as far as I'm aware, about 20 years ago in Japan, when the Japanese central bank, as a result of various financial crises, but particularly the Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s, had continuously lowered interest rates until they were at zero. And all of these measures just hadn't taken the necessary effect of getting inflation going and getting investment in the economy going. And so they were, I think, slightly at a loss at what to do. And that is when the Japanese central bank more or less invented the concept of quantitative easing, of buying financial assets as a means of injecting money into the economy. This is something the Federal Reserve did as a result of the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, and the ECB started with in 2014. So I mean, just looking sort of at sort of the history of the program, I mean, before the pandemic started, the ECB had around 2.3 trillion euros worth of assets on its books that it had bought over a period of 5 or 6 years. And the overwhelming majority of that is our sovereign bonds. So this is actually what it spent most of its time doing, is buying the debt of countries. And that's very much what it's doing today. But in fact, when the ECB started this, it wasn't buying sovereign bonds at all. It was buying so-called covered bonds. So essentially corporate bonds that are covered by some form of collateral. It started then in 2015, 2016, buying sovereign debt, and then in, I believe, late 2016, started buying corporate bonds, which is sort of the issue that we're addressing in the climate context. Now, and interestingly enough, they had more or less stopped buying assets about a year and a half ago, and started again in late 2019. And it's really been the pandemic where the ECB has massively scaled up its purchasing of assets across all of the asset classes. So I think it was in mid-March that the ECB Governing Council took the decision to add first 120 billion and then another 750 billion euros to its asset purchasing. I think that figure currently stands at about 1.3 trillion that the ECB is willing to spend. And there's in fact an interesting Italian story in all of this mix, that when the first decision was taken and the markets reacted quite negatively, Lagarde was asked about what she was going to do to close the spread. And what that question means is the difference in the interest that the Italian government pays on its bonds to the interest that the German government pays on its bonds, which is very much a sort of a reflection of the bond market as a whole. And at the time, her response was, well, let's say, left something to be desired. And it was after that then that the ECB really ramped up its program to what it is today. And as far as I'm aware, since this program started, the additional pandemic emergency purchasing program started 3 or 4 months ago, they have spent about 100 billion euros a month. So that's kind of the size we're talking about. And interestingly enough, and that's my final sentence, reading in the Financial Times today that the estimates are that the purchases that the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank will make this year will be the net new issue of the entire sovereign bond and corporate bond market. So obviously they're buying older bonds, but sort of in terms of a size, it is everything that is being issued this year. And that is quite phenomenal in terms of the scale of what's going on here.
Yes, so with reference to stop doing business as usual, which role does Greenpeace think should be the ECB measure to tackle the climate emergency, to stop supporting fossil fuel companies? Have you taken already some initiative in face of the ECB?
Yeah, so I mean, we are just
apart your paper,
sure,
which is
sure.
the analysis first.
So this is the paper was very much a first step. We are sort of slowly scaling up our campaign, which will run over the next year or so. So what we are doing at the moment is we are meeting the European Central Bank. We're meeting with national central banks who sit in the governing council of the ECB and take the decisions together with the president. We are going to be coming out with further pieces of analysis. We're going to be engaging in the consultation, and we may also be setting, let's say, sort of more traditional Greenpeace type initiatives later on in the day. But maybe to come to your question, what is it that the ECB can do? Well, there's actually many different things that the ECB can do. So up till now, all we've been talking about is the purchase of corporate bonds. And I think there's a reason why a lot of the conversations are about that, because it is just the most tangible and easily understandable thing that the ECB can do. So the ECB, as I've talked about, as you've also mentioned, is one of the biggest purchasers of financial assets in the world. And as such, they have a big influence on the market. So there it's very simple. We are just asking the ECB to stop buying the assets of fossil fuel companies and certain other high carbon sectors. But there's many other things the ECB can do. So the next thing that we're asking and demanding of the ECB refers to what is known as the collateral framework. So to put it quite simply, when the ECB loans money to banks, which it does all of the time, right? It lends money to banks overnight, it lends money to banks long term. The ECB asks for some form of collateral, some form of security for the event that the borrower, the bank, should default. And with in the determination of what qualifies as collateral, what qualifies as a security, actually the ECB can have a big effect on the market. I'll give you one example. So the SNB, the Swiss National Bank, refuses any type of financial asset that is related to weapons manufacturing. And so what we would ask the ECB in this case to do is to exclude a number of different types of assets from its collateral framework, such as oil and gas companies. And the effect that then has is when a bank thinks about the kind of assets it purchases, there's many different things that a bank thinks about, but clearly one of these issues is, can I use this asset as security in my day-to-day dealings? And if the bank has the clear signal from its regulator, from the ECB, no, we're not going to accept that as collateral, then that makes that asset considerably less attractive to hold. And that's exactly what we want. We want fossil fuel assets to be less attractive to hold, to reflect the climate risk that is associated with funding fossil fuel companies and their activities. There's various other things. So one of the issues that I mentioned earlier, and that is a big problem generally in all of this discussion, is the issue of transparency. So a lot of the time when we do pieces of analysis, when we're looking at sort of, what's going on in the market, how much money are banks lending to fossil fuel companies, how many bonds do they hold of fossil fuel companies, you can generally find most of that information somewhere, but it's very difficult to find, and you don't know what the impact of that is. So what we're asking the ECB to do for its own balance sheet, but also to demand of the banks that it regulates, is full mandatory disclosure about the carbon footprint of those balance sheets. And I think that would make a big difference if we know sort of, Bank A balance sheets, the money it's lending to and investing in fossil fuel companies has a carbon footprint of X tons. That makes it much more easy for consumers, for investors to make decisions based on those criteria. And there are many other things it can do. I won't go into every last detail, what maybe one other thing that can be very effective is in terms of regulation, how much capital and reserves the ECB requires that banks hold when they make, for example, loans to certain companies. And here we would say the risk of lending money to fossil fuel companies is high because there is a climate risk attached to that. And that means you need to hold more reserves vis-a-vis those loans. And that makes those loans more expensive and less attractive for the banks to engage in. So there may be a few of the things that the ECB can and should be doing.
Yes, thank you. It's very interesting. And let's go through the DiEM25 idea about how to go toward an ecological transition. Well, during the pandemic, DiEM25 introduced a three-step intervention. The first one being a sort of helicopter money, as I said before, saying inject 2,000 euro of solidarity cash payment directly to the citizen, which is a way to avoid all the slow transmission that goes through the monetary transmission through financial intermediaries. And this is one step. And the other step was the idea of an issue of ECB bond directly to gather finance to avoid an over indebtedness of government to spend for wealth system and all the emergency related to the pandemic. So the idea of a Eurobond issued by the ECB with 30 years of duration to lessen the over-indebtedness of certain country that has to recover toward all the cuts in public expenditure that the austerity attitude of Europe has imposed during this year, that has been translated in a number of deaths during COVID-19. And another step is related to the role of the European Investment Bank, which is one of the first institutions that started to issue green bond, which means bond related to investment oriented to the ecological transition. And in addition, the European Investment Bank is the first financial institution at European level who changed the statute to impose a green credit policy to avoid any incentive to carbon industry. So I think, and in the Green New Deal for Europe vision, the European Investment Bank is the institution, the public bank, which can support the countries in reorient their economy toward a neutral environmental and climate economy. So, in our vision, the green investment through green bond of ECB should rise to the 5% of the GDP to assure a green transition by the 2030, because 2050 it's too far as a point in time to achieve the climate neutrality. So I think that even ECB should be more ambitious. And anyway, and another measure that you can find in the blueprint for the just transition is the fact that ECB should insert in the mandate the fact of freeze any share buyback and dividends to investors until banks have divested of all fossil fuel assets. And even this, I think, it's a strong measure to accelerate the transition we need. Well, let me pass to the fourth question. And well, a famous Fridays for Future slogan is, if the climate was a bank, it would have already been saved. Greenpeace is famous for its blatant campaigns of civil disobedience, with sheep checking the melting ice or the level of pollution of the sea. A European campaign of pressure to convince the central banking system not to finance fossil industry would accelerate ecological conversion. Have you thought about it? What are your next campaign from this point of view?
Yeah, thanks for the question, and also very interesting to hear your perspective and your vision for the ECB and the green recovery. And I must say, largely that is absolutely something I can 100% agree with. In fact, I mean, given that the European Investment Bank has a very, very innovative energy lending policy, in as much as it sort of excludes more or less all fossil fuels from lending, I think it would be a very interesting proposal for the ECB to be backing EIB bonds and that a way of funding the Green New Deal and making sure that the recovery from the coronavirus is indeed a green recovery. And I think it's maybe important to outline, what a crucial moment we are at. Not just sort of from the climate point of view, we all know that, but I think the point and the situation we have right now is that over the next, say, 2 or 3 years, as we've seen already now with the ECB, there are going to be trillions of euros spent in Europe and much, much more across the world. And this is really an unbelievable chance to invest in so many of the things that we need, from education, healthcare, public transport infrastructure, green energy, and really create this transition to a more socially just and a more green Europe. And I think this is really something we must embrace. I think when it comes to your question, I think that is definitely something we are thinking about right now. I'd say our campaign on various banks and also on the European Investment Bank, as part of a coalition of organizations last year, showed that we can put pressure on these institutions and we can create substantial change. So I certainly wouldn't rule out that kind of Greenpeace campaign on some of the institutions we've been talking about over the next few months. I think it's always important to take things one step at a time, and this is sort of very much a kind of a new area of campaigning. This is something that we need to introduce to our supporters. I think it's quite clear, and it's very important also to start, from my point of view, with a dialogue, to make clear sort of what are our demands and what it is that we want to change. And then when we see that change is not happening, in fact, then we can talk of course about maybe harder and more traditional Greenpeace measures and methods of campaigning. Absolutely.
Yes, thank you. Well, before concluding, I just a good news. I would mention that very recently the European Parliament approved, as follow-up to the 2018 Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, the regulation on the establishment of a framework to facilitate sustainable investment, the so-called taxonomy regulation. This regulation established an EU-wide classification system for sustainable economic activity with the purpose to facilitate sustainable investment. So the green bond will be better defined. And in addition, let me remember that in the Green New Deal for Europe vision, there should be more space for the public banks and especially cooperative banks to go back to the origin of financing and diverge from the financialization which created an unstable financial market and impoverished the real economy. So we need financing in farmer-driven agriculture. We need community-based financing architectures to make closer the investment to the green transition to the people who lives in the community. I mean, this is a piece of democratizing the economy, which is in the heart of Green New Deal for Europe. So when we approach to the end, I would like to close with a comment from you on a video of your traditional climate campaign. It might be a good omen for future joint action, I hope. So let's start with this video, which is extraordinary, I think. Well, very impressive. I love Ludovico Einaudi, and I think it doesn't worth any words to comment these images. But I think that that type of campaign could suggest that the climate crisis doesn't bother us. It's not close to us, but it is indeed. Last night, I don't know if you know, but in Palermo, in Sicily, just in few hours, the rain of average rain of 1 year fall down and a lot of damages and problem caused with 1 meter and 25 centimeters of water into the city. So I think that we need to reinforce what Fridays for Future all over the world have initiated. And what's your thought about these?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I really couldn't agree more. I mean, I think, you know, there is not much to say about this video specifically. Words don't do it justice. I've seen this video so many times, and I still every time get goosebumps. It's just it's amazing. It's a beautiful piece of music, and it's just a very, very spectacular setting. And I think, you know, maybe what it shows a little is, you know, I mean, I think climate change, the climate crisis is so very global, but it's also so very local. And I think, you know, maybe to take something local, especially from an Italian point of view, you know, and you know, and put it in say this global setting, you know, the Arctic, which has so much become a symbol of what we're doing to the planet. That was sort of the idea, and, you know, really just to create something beautiful and inspiring. But I do agree with you that the question is, how do we tie this story to people's everyday lives? You know, climate has often been, I think, seen as something that's far away. It's in the future. It takes place in the Philippines, and it takes place in Antarctica, and it's not, you know, it's not my problem here in Europe. And I think actually to say no, it is very much affecting us in Europe today, and this will and is already, as your example from Palermo from yesterday shows, is already creating huge changes. One of the things we did last year in my country, in Austria, was, you know, to really look at what is changing in Austria as a relation, as a result of climate change. And actually, you see everything is changing. Landscapes are changing. Agriculture is changing. Our water supply is changing. I mean, one of the symbols of our country, and also indeed of your country, are glaciers. And if we carry on like this, in 50 years, in 100 years, there will be no more glaciers in the Alps. And yeah, I do believe very much that we need to make this story as local as we can, and you know, as tied into people's everyday lives as we can. You know, people often say, you know, we have this kind of disconnect sometimes between sort of end of the month and end of the world. You know, end of the month are people, you know, worried about their jobs, worried about their income, their family, existential issues, and then you have sort of end of the world. But actually, these things very much interact with each other, and ways to I think show that and you know, bring the climate story closer to people are really, really important. But at the same time, you know, I think activities like the one in the video also have a certain role to play in sort of, you know, they're being very spectacular and at the same time sort of very emotional. Yeah.
Yes, I agree, but I hope that we will have the capacity and the occasion to organize local initiative, transnational, at the same time in various places, creating, joining campaigns of Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, Green New Deal for Europe. And we have to make our voice louder, and for this we have go together. So in addition, I think we need to expand the role of public finance, because only with public finance devoted to the green transition, we can achieve the goal that we need to achieve in the right time and not too late. So thanks a lot. I don't know if in Facebook there were some questions. I asked to Alberto. Alberto, there are some questions for Adam in Facebook.
You already answered all the questions arrived, in fact. I have to say I was very proud of our watchers, of all the people in DM who seem quite, not quite, who seem very, very aligned with what we were talking about, with such a great knower of the issues like Adam, which we thank you very much.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, Adam. So I'll get in touch with you for next campaign. Okay.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you a lot again.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.
And it's been great talking to you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Bye. And we also remember you will find this video later on our YouTube channel on DM25 Italia. Thank you. Goodbye.